patterns of clientelistic politics that often involve the delivery of small gifts. This can be cash gifts, or it can be sometimes, more rarely, but sometimes also small gifts of household items to voters at election times. One of the things we encountered while meeting with local researchers, but above all with local candidates and local campaigners, is that candidates in the two countries develop campaign teams that are remarkably similar in structure. And you can see a sort of a map of these campaign teams on the screen in front of you. That is that the candidate will typically select or recruit a few helpers, often from their own family member or close friends or from a similar organization, who then in turn recruit brokers who take charge of particular geographical units, barangay in the case of the Philippines, desa or kelurahan in the case of Indonesia, who then recruit sub-brokers beneath them, and then who in turn recruit brokers underneath them, who then enlist voters who make a commitment to voting for the candidate in exchange for a cash payment or some other gift. And in talking to political candidates in the two countries, it was just really remarkable, both how they had developed these very similar structures of brokerage teams, but also how in many ways the strategies and techniques they developed in order to engage in this form of politics were so similar. Who they targeted, for example, typically telling their brokers that they should only target people they're very close to, they're related to, people they trust, how they approach people, how they deal with the perpetual challenge of clientelistic politics, which is how to ensure that the people you give money or other gifts to end up voting for you. And we, I should draw attention to the journal article there where Alan Hicken and I did some comparison of the structures of vote buying and clientelistic politics in the two countries. Working with our local collaborators, we had the opportunity to go beyond, however, these superficial observations and conduct surveys of the brokers who were in the teams in the two countries. And it was only then, when we did this very detailed research, that it began to be clear that in some ways, these brokerage teams, although they looked very similar and in many ways they operated in very comparable ways, in some ways were actually quite different. And you can see that in some of the responses we get to these surveys. For example, even on trivial things, the average age of the Philippines brokers was much older than those in Indonesia. Or look at table 4 here. You can see also that most of the brokers in Indonesia only had a very small number of people on their voter list, whereas many of those in the Philippines were managing very large groups of voters and delivering cash and gifts to much larger groups. Similarly, the sort of people they were approaching. In the Indonesian case, Indonesian brokers were instructed by their candidates only to approach families, friends, and neighbors, whereas in the Philippines case, we also got many who were also reaching out to broader groups of people. And perhaps most revealingly of all, we can see that in the case of the Philippines, very few of the people who were on these campaign teams in the Philippines were getting salaries or getting expenses paid, covered by the candidates, whereas most of those in the case of Indonesia were. However, by the same token, many people in the Philippines who participated in these teams expected a job after the election from their candidate or some other form of patronage, whereas very few in Indonesia did so. So you can see that once we started comparing these two teams, which look so similar in a very detailed manner between the two countries, it seems that they had these very dissimilar features. And to cut a long story short, this helped Alan, I, and our other collaborators to really start to delve into, well, what might explain these differences? And in the article I just mentioned, we argue that it tells us actually a lot about the different political systems and the ways that clientelism is managed in the two countries, with the critical difference being that the teams that candidates construct in the Philippines are much more enduring, much more stable entities than they are in Indonesia. In the Indonesian case, candidates form these teams. They're called Tim Sukses or success teams most commonly. And often they really only last for the election. Whereas in the Philippines case, these teams constructed by candidates tend to be much more permanent structures, and they can last not only between elections, but also sometimes for many years. And people can be involved in these very long-term, lasting and stable relationships with the political candidates and politicians who sponsor them. This is partly related to differences in the electoral systems. In the Philippines, mayors runs with a ticket of councillors, so there's much more sort of cooperation and stability in these sorts of electoral arrangements. But in Indonesia, candidates are often on their own. They have to raise their own money. They don't have the ability to organize their campaign teams in such a permanent or long-lasting way as a result. It's also related to the fact that Indonesian politicians, compared to their Philippine counterparts at least, tend to have relatively weak access to state resources. In the Philippines, local politicians, especially mayors, but also Congress people, are able to build much more enduring teams. In Indonesia, politicians often struggle to access state resources, and they invest their own resources in elections, i.e. these are often self-funded campaigns. So teams tend to not last very long, because if a candidate doesn't get elected, what's the point of maintaining a team? Whereas if you have been elected, you don't need your team. So to explain this, we felt we really needed to go right back to the deep history of state formation in the two countries. How is it that these much more stable political arrangements are able to develop in the Philippines compared to Indonesia? Now, I won't try and summarize the whole argument we came up with here, but suffice it to say that we find a lot of the explanation in history, in the Philippines, development of electoral politics prior to the development of a strong bureaucracy, which means that important political families and other politicians were able to sort of capture the local resources of the state very early in Philippines political history, and then use these resources to build much more enduring political machines. Where in Indonesia, of course, we saw the dominance of a stronger state, a bureaucracy, both the army and the civilian bureaucracy in the Indonesian case. And politicians, political parties, local political actors have just never been able to achieve the sort of long-term political control over local political resources that their counterparts in the Philippines have been able to. And this in turn led us to develop a whole sort of theory about how clientelistic political systems can differ, and the historical and institutional differences from those sources. If you're interested in learning more about this, I would just direct you to the book that my colleagues and I authored on this, and also to the series of edited volumes, including one on Indonesia and the Philippines that we've published over the last decade or so. But in some ways, the details of the argument are not really what I'm trying to underline here. It's more giving this as an example of how we, in comparing the two countries, we can learn not only about what it is that makes Indonesia unique, what it is that makes the Philippines unique, but also we can use that act of comparison to engage in much more ambitious and far-reaching theory building that hopefully, if we're successful in our academic mission, can at least help us travel, help our arguments travel even beyond Southeast Asia. Just to give you another example, and this is one from a work in progress, so with the same group of scholars that are mentioned on the cover of the book here, but also again with a large number of great research collaborators in Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines and Indonesia, we're engaged in a new project which looks at grassroots politics in urban parts of Southeast Asia. And just to give you a sense of this process of discovery, we were on a research trip quite recently where my colleagues and I visited local ward offices in cities across Southeast Asia. And one of the places we visited were these kelurahan. So this is the equivalent of the barangay for colleagues from the Philippines. The kelurahan, several kelurahan offices in Surabaya. And my colleague who works on the Philippines in particular, Paul Hutchcroft, was absolutely blown away by the strength of the civilian bureaucracy at this level of Indonesian government. He was really shocked to find that the lura, so the equivalent of the barangay captain, in these offices were professional civil servants. Many of them had had careers for 20 or more years as civil servants. They had extensive staff, sometimes 10 or 12 staff members who were also career civil servants and who'd been rotated throughout various parts of the city government. So he was amazed to find that we have this very robust civilian civil service bureaucracy operating at that level. A few weeks later, when we visited the Philippines and visited some barangay in places like Cebu City and Iloilo, it became obvious to me why it was that he'd become so shocked by this difference. Because in these barangay, in these cities, we found that, and I'm sure our Philippine colleagues watching this would view this as completely normal. We see much more elective office and much more short-term appointments. So, for example, in one city in one barangay in Cebu City, and I should say that the functions of the barangay and the kelurahan are quite comparable. But in this one barangay in Cebu City, we found that the barangay captain, of course, was an elected rather than an appointed official. And he explained that when he'd been elected, there were about 160 or 180 positions in his barangay, many of them sort of semi-voluntary or people receiving honorariums. And he had replaced every single one of those positions with people who were from his election team. So you get these jobs, which in the Indonesian case are professional civil service positions, in the Philippines case, being provided essentially as a form of patronage or political appointment. Now, we're not quite sure where we're going to take this comparison, but we can see that it's quite a fundamental difference in what on the surface look like these very similar organs of micro-local politics in the two countries. So in other words, looking at this sort of level then helps us to explain some of the other divergences that we see in the pattern of urban politics across the region. For example, we find that in most of the other countries, or in 3 of the other countries we're looking at, Malaysia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, we see this new standard model of urban reform really sweeping through Southeast Asian cities. Many of you will be familiar with this: e-budgeting, e-procurement, online governance, these online applications which are used for citizens to express their complaints and so on. It seems to be much weaker in the Philippines. Now, why might this be? Well, perhaps it's because the barangay leaders are a critical part of the political machines of the mayors. Again, I'm just, you know, in many ways, I'm sure this sort of comparison is not surprising to many of you, but I'm just using this as an illustrative example of the way in which we can take things that for us seem to be sort of normal and unexceptional everyday parts of politics. And once you start comparing countries, you can start to see, well, perhaps what you view as normal is in fact rather unique or distinctive. And we can start to use those comparisons to develop bigger arguments. How am I going for time, Ayu?
We actually have to have another 3 to 4 minutes.
Okay, all right. So that should be about good. I mean, I'm not going to I'm not going to end with any sort of profound reflections, but just to offer some potential topics that have always struck me as being potentially very fruitful for comparison between the Philippines and Indonesia. So one of the things here really concerns the big arc of democratic change in the two countries in the last 3 or 4 decades. As I said before, in many ways, when you put the Indonesian and Philippines experiences side by side, you can sketch out some broad comparisons. The democratic breakthrough and construction of a democratic order in many ways, well, both the sort of the, as I've already said, the sort of nature of the authoritarian regimes were not entirely dissimilar. The pattern of breakdown of authoritarianism was also broadly compromised. There were some differences, which at the time seemed to be, at least to me, seemed to be very significant. It seemed to me to be very significant that there was much more sort of a compromise element with the old regime in the Indonesian case. So you had former Golkar leaders, former military officers and so on playing a much more prominent role in post-Suharto politics than I think we saw in the Philippines case. Yet in many ways, the outcomes in the two countries are sort of broadly comparable, aren't they? I mean, we hear a lot about some of these so-called democratic deficits, dynastic politics, clientelism, oligarchy. We see very similar language used to describe the outcomes in the two countries. So I think there's room for a much more sort of systematic and comprehensive comparison of the way in which the patterns of democratization in the two countries have produced both diverging and converging patterns of democratic politics in post-authoritarian Indonesia and the Philippines. I'll give you a few more specific examples. One is the presence or absence of the left. One of the conventional sort of tropes or sort of arguments that is often made about Indonesian politics is that we get oligarchic dominance in post-Suharto Indonesian politics. You know, all the political parties are dominated by these oligarchic actors. There's this high level of continuity in underlying power relations between the Suharto period and the post-Suharto period. And there is a body of literature that suggests that, well, one reason for this weakness is that Indonesia has lacked the presence of a political left, that this is a legacy of the 1965-1966 massacre of the Communist Party and its allies. And if that had not happened, we might see a very different form of democratic politics in Indonesia. It seems to me that there's obvious grounds for comparison here, because we know that certainly we can't say the left is a powerful political force in contemporary Philippines politics, but the left has had a much greater presence in Philippines politics since the 1960s than we've seen in the Indonesian case. What are the implications of that? What are the implications of the absence of a left versus its continuing presence, perhaps fading presence, in the case of the Philippines? I've never really seen systematic comparison on that topic, though it seems so important. Another potential topic of comparison, I think, where there's a lot of work to be done is on the role of political dynasties. We know that this has been a continuing a feature of Philippines politics. And again, I'll mention my brief visit to Cebu City. It won't amaze, I'm sure, any of our Philippines colleagues who are speaking, but for someone who studies Indonesian politics, it was amazing to walk into the entry of the city hall in Cebu City and to see the portraits of all the past mayors of that city and to see the same family names recurring again and again. In fact, not just these current local political bosses like the Osmanias and the Ramas, going right back to the 1930s and the 1940s, but there were also even a couple of Estradas, not Estradas, of Dutertes in there. We just don't have that sort of experience of long-term political dynasties in Indonesia, or much less of it, but it's an emerging pattern. Seems to be much weaker, but I think there's a lot those of us who study Indonesia can learn from the Philippines case, and hopefully vice versa. There's a whole lot of other, I mean, this is where I start to get a bit brainstormy, so I won't keep going for very long. The role of police in politics. Local politicians have much more leeway or control over the police than in the Philippines than they do in Indonesia. What are the implications of that? Ethnic politics is a huge one for me. It always strikes me when I visit the Philippines that here we have a country that is as multi-ethnic as Indonesia, or almost as multi-ethnic as Indonesia, but where ethnicity seems to play a much, much less significant role in local politics. We know in Indonesian local politics, when candidates for mayor or bupati are looking for their running mate, ethnicity, at least in multi-ethnic parts of the country, is often the #1 consideration that they take into account. Yet ethnic politics seems to play very little role in the Philippines. I think that would be a fascinating topic for comparison. Peace negotiations and post-conflict peace building, also transitional justice. I see some of the speakers at this conference are speaking on these topics. Seems to be a great area for comparison. Or a one that's very relevant in the contemporary world, where we know that the son of a former authoritarian ruler has already been elected in the Philippines, and perhaps, just perhaps, the former son-in-law of one will soon be elected in Indonesia. Is this the place of authoritarian nostalgia? So anyway, the list of potential topics for comparison potentially goes on and on. These are just a few ideas that occurred to me as I was preparing this talk, but it's a list which I hope gives an indication of how transformative I found the process of visiting, even for short periods, and I'm sure in many ways a very superficial manner, the Philippines, and the potential for comparative research of the sort being advocated in this conference has. So once again, my congratulations to the organizers. May this initiative lead to many new attempts to engage in concerted, comprehensive and long-term comparison between the two countries. Thank you everyone for your patience, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was really rich, very insightful, and very helpful for us. And you're right. One of the aims for this collaboration, for this conference, is that we really want to have more studies, comparative studies. Firstly, you know, when talking about democracy, usually, as you also mentioned, most of us tends to go for case studies, and in this sense for Indonesians are mostly Indonesian studies, and very rarely to do comparative studies with other countries. And we're so glad that you assess that comparing Indonesia and Philippines, like what we're trying to do here, is on the right track, and yay for that. Also, thank you for the sharing. Sounds like your research is very fascinating, and I look forward for the grassroots politics on the urban part, and some of the potential topics that you suggested. I think that's so many avenues for us to try to pursue for research and collaborations in the future. So thank you again, Ed. So we're going to take the question and answer after the second keynote speaker. Would you mind to stay here, Ed, for the next speaker? Okay, great. Thank you. So we are now to Professor Um, I hope I'm pronounce it correctly. Jorge Tino, if I'm sorry if I'm pronounced it wrong. But yes, Professor Tino, the screen is yours.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And sir, I join Ed in also expressing my appreciation for having been invited to speak here to actually do a keynote with Ed. I guess it's also good that I'm speaking after Ed, because a lot of the things that he has touched on about comparative politics, the importance of comparative politics, and all, I will no longer be touching on in my own presentation. I do apologize that, I mean, much of what I will be speaking about is not new to people who are keen observers of Philippine politics. My goal here is essentially to reflect on the saga that is Philippine democratization. And like I said, I do apologize if much of what I'll be touching on is not new to us in the discipline of political science and the field of comparative politics, as well as to observers of Philippine politics. I hope that you can glean some value in the points that I'll be making about the Philippines, specifically in relation to better understanding events and trajectories in Indonesia. Philippine democratic institutions have been constantly under threat from all directions, ranging from right-wing militarist groups, left-wing ideological groups, religious radicalism, to lately even authoritarian populism. And there seems to be something happening to and in the Philippines that will always threaten either the free press, the free expression of opinions and ideas, as well as the principle of free association and free choice. Professor Arugay earlier has mentioned this about the Philippines and Indonesia, the Freedom House scores of Indonesia and the Philippines. In the case of the Philippines, I mean, the Freedom House score in 2016 has gone down to 23. From 65 in 2016, went down to 59 in 2020, and now it's 58. Seems like the Philippines, the Philippine experience with democracy is like one step forward and two steps back. And most apparent of this two steps back take is the results of the elections of May 2022. As Ed has mentioned, where not only did we see the return of a popularly deposed political family, but also the further entrenchment of a family of oligarchies and political dynasties, raising the question of what lies ahead for this Philippine-style democratic system. But before I begin, well, speaking as a teacher of politics, it's important that we establish what exactly do we mean by democracy. And to me, democracy has two dimensions, the procedural dimension and the substantive dimension. The procedural dimension of democracy places emphasis on the process and the practice of leadership selection, leadership succession, as well as making public officials more accountable through regular political organizations like political parties. We should not underestimate the importance of the procedural dimension of democracy, even though it can be rather limited in its scope. Some might think it's shallow, hollow, in the way that we treat democracy. You could say it's necessary, but not exactly sufficient ingredient for democracy. Without procedural democracy, substantive democracy will have no solid foundation to stand on. And so procedures ensure continuity and consistency, and the most notable features of procedural democracy are elections, of course, and political parties. The substantive dimension of democracy can be seen as the outcome of the procedural dimension of democracy. These outcomes can range from having government that is limited and respectful of the rights of individuals in society. More importantly, substantive democracy can be expressed through a complex and comprehensive agreement between the rulers and the ruled, something we call the social contract. And substantive democracy is kind of the fuel that runs the procedural aspect. The substantive dimension ensures that there is a viable and desirable outcome from the democratic process. I know that for most of us, these two dimensions of democracy are not new. I bring them up here because I will touch on these two dimensions again somewhat later in my presentation. Suffice to say that if we are to examine or navigate the democratization process of any country, whether it's the Philippines or Indonesia, we would need these two dimensions as reference points, sort of like your longitude and latitude. Okay, so despite what might be said about democracy's strengths and high degree of desirability, it also has its weaknesses and shortcomings. And a few things do need to be said about our expectations about democracy, which I believe we need to temper and sort of disabuse ourselves about. Democracy is not a utopia for everyone. It's not supposed to bring miracles like prosperity right away or make people rich right away. In fact, it's the hardest to create and sustain, but it's the easiest to destroy. Democracy also doesn't have an autopilot switch where you can just relax after setting it up, leave it by itself and it will run by itself. The fact is, the system includes us. So you cannot leave it by itself and expect it to work properly. Democracy requires constant guarding, nurturing, and care from everyone. Finally, it's important that we understand that becoming and establishing a democracy is a long and arduous process, and that I would say there's no single pathway to it. One can follow a particular model and end up with a totally different outcome. The Philippines being one example of that. Following the US presidential system, we end up with totally different outcomes. Although I can't say that now, in the recent years especially, in the case of the US. But anyway, if we look at the saga of democratization in the Philippines, I would divide it into 4 stages. Beginning, of course, in the early 1900s under formal American tutelage, up to the Declaration of Independence, or the formal granting of independence to the Philippines. This period of tutelage, however, actually saw, and this I think is also what Ed was pointing out earlier, actually saw the Americans going along for the ride with locally entrenched oligarchs of the likes of Quezon and Osmeña. And it was during this period that we inherited the formal institutional apparatus from the Americans that would later on become the backbone of the procedural dimension of our democratic system. Now, when the Philippines gained its formal independence from the US. That's when the less formal tutelage kicked in. And it also marks the institutionalization of an elected political oligarchy in the country, where elections become a system for formalizing elite family rule. Some might say, well, this thing only started in the 2000s. I would argue that it's been going on even before we received formal independence, and especially after we got our independence from the Americans. The next phase is, in this saga, is what I refer to as an authoritarian interlude experiment, in which you had, and Ed has also pointed this out, Marcos riding the wave of authoritarian attraction, but when you already have an entrenched oligarchy, an authoritarian system would be the next logical and necessary step. Especially if one were to recall, for example, the work of Plato. This was also the period when the Philippines rode the wave of authoritarian discourses that was evident not only here in Asia, but also in Latin America and even in Europe. And certainly the authoritarian system that Marcos initiated was by no means an original one. Okay. The New Society and his democratic revolution from the center is actually a combination of Sukarno's guided democracy and Suharto's Ordebaro, as well as follows in the footsteps of Brazil's and Portugal's Estado Novo. So the thing is, things have to be new or renewed, and we're seeing that resurgence of being new with the current political administration. Since 1986, the Philippines has, in my view, only temporarily shelved the authoritarian option and has seen the resurgence of a largely resurgence and continuance of a largely elitist style political system. The authoritarian option, however, still remains on the table, and since 2016 at least, has shown itself on the surface from time to time. What are the mainstays of the Philippine democratization saga? These mainstays are what I would say are the main obstacles to a stable, genuine, and thoroughgoing democratic experience in the country. We have an oligarchic, an elitist political system that favors the rich, the famous, the powerful, despite or in spite of the open franchise, electoral franchise that we have had since '86. Our party list system, which was intended to be an innovation in representation, has been turned into an extension of political dynasties. Relatedly, cronyism continues. Who you know matters more than what you know, leading to a bureaucracy, and has mentioned this also, a bureaucracy that has become politicized, unprofessional, and treated as a private possession. Patronage relations dominate the society and the polity. From time to time, patronage is complemented by violence and fraud for greater effect. John Seidel has documented some of these instances of using violence and fraud in the form of bossism. In addition to patronage, patrimonialism is also a constant in Philippine politics, where public office is seen and treated as a private or even a personal possession of the office holder. So in effect, the politician becomes the office, and he turns it into his personal possession. Finally, one cannot ignore or set aside the vital role of the state in not only being an instrument of popular democratization, popular empowerment from 86 maybe up to 2004, but also as an instrument for entrenched oligarchic rule, especially after 2004. In a country where the bureaucracy is largely weak and unprofessional, as I mentioned earlier, and even lacking in critical expertise, it's to be expected that your state now will act essentially as Marx would put it, the executive committee of the ruling class. Let me now touch on some trajectories for the country's democratization saga, starting with this slide of a survey that was done by social weather stations across the years from, I think, 87 up to now, about how Filipinos perceive democracy. And you can see that the highest percentage of Filipinos since 87 are actually satisfied with how democracy works. Ironically, at a time when the country just elected the son of the dictator, whom people have ousted back in 86. Are we seeing a kind of desubstantiation of democracy here, or a hollowing out of democracy? Another slide here shows how satisfied people are with democracy compared to other global regions. You will find again that the Philippines appears to be the happiest, with the most satisfied with democracy. But considering what the mainstays, and the milestones are in the case of the Philippines, makes you wonder, what exactly people's conceptions are of democracy. And so we could be in that phase of what Adele Webb describes as democratic ambivalence. Filipinos, well, they know what democracy is, but at the same time, their understanding of democracy is a bit more nuanced. For example, here in this case, I'm referring to a World Values Survey, actually, that was done in 2019 on the Philippines. You can look it up also in the case of Indonesia. I have some figures for Indonesia comparing them, but I just decided on showing the Philippines here. In 2019, while a significant majority of Filipinos look upon the democratic system as good, roughly about the same percentage of Filipinos, same proportion of Filipinos, also look at leaders resorting to non-democratic means as being good as well. So what exactly are we now saying about our understanding of democracy? It really, it raises that question of how people, Filipinos in particular, have understood democracy over the years, particularly since 1986. And, well, this is actually my last slide. The Philippine system can be described as an unstable and unconsolidated democracy. A former colleague of mine in the department described it as suboptimal. It continues to perform in suboptimal terms, unable to reap the benefits of the popular uprising that ushered its formation back in '86, ironically, and that any openings that EDSA 86 has made have actually now been closed off to all but the few powerful and well-connected. And in short, democracy is no longer the only game in town, to put it in the words of one Linz. So I guess I will end it at that. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Tino. I think it's very deep and insightful from the context of the Philippines. And there is also, I think most of the participants here are our students. And I'm pretty sure that this is the first time they've heard in deep, the situation, the updates of the Philippines democracy, which are very useful for them. Yesterday, we also learned a bit on the decentralization and local autonomy from Ella. And also it was a very good discussions we had yesterday. So now I'm welcoming participants if you have any questions or comments from the two speakers that we've just had. If you can also text your questions or comments in the chat box, or you can raise your hands if you want to speak directly. Anyone? We have Musa, Pak Musa. Pak Musa, are you, can you, yeah, okay. So
Okay.
Pak Musa is our Vice Rector for Students and Corporations, but also a prominent, Vice Dean. And also one of the senior lecturers at the International Relations Department. Pak Musa.
Okay. Thank you, Mbak Ayu. Just want to have a simple questions to George. You were saying that democracy is not utopia. Can you give us a like experience or example that democracy is real in a country?
I'm sorry,
like
what's the first part of the question again? I didn't hear that.
George, you were saying about democracy is not utopia.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay. Just want to know what kind perfect or real democracy did you already experience or know in a country? I mean,
Yes.
yeah, because I still cannot see what kind of essential or real democracy in any country in the world, even like America. Like America is not democracy, but it's more on plutocracy, something like that. Okay, that's it. I think. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Musa. I think that is what, by definition, a utopia is. It's not actually a reality, but the ideal of democracy is what you're trying to hope for. And I mean, it's really the case that no real world system is perfect, is that good. With I don't know, maybe if you are a small community, then it's possible to create